Good morning, one and all. Welcome to another session of the online Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Sheridan service. We are glad that you joined us this morning. If there are newcomers among you, welcome, and we welcome all our old friends and members back for another week. We are on. I don't know how to say that we're broadcasting on live from our building here in Sheridan, Wyoming, and we welcome you all this morning. Announcements, as always, we will invite you. We'll proceed a little slowly right here. We'll invite you to text or chat your announcements into us this morning. The information would be on the announcement that Victor sent out. So I don't have any announcements this morning other than the usual that we're here each week at 10 o'clock. Following our service, there will be an opportunity to go onto a Face Chat, or is it a Zoom session to do some networking with members who'd like to greet each other this morning. That's also on the announcement that Victor sends out once a week. So,
and one quick announcement for services in June. Cal is organizing the June services, and he says, please let Cal know if you'd like to present on the theme of transcendence in June. There are readings available, and he would be happy to help you plan. And he says a big thank you. And Cal, I'll just jump in and say, I'll take a week in June. Okay, so you've got one down. I don't have any other announcements that I can see. Let me check again. I don't see any other announcements.
And as luck would have it, the topic that I'm finishing, which is mystery, we have some references today to Emerson and other transcendentalists, so that will make a nice segue into Cal's next month of transcendence. We're so well organized, aren't we, Cal?
That's great. Yeah, let me know when you're ready for joys and concerns.
Okay, I'm going to read some opening words from Ralph Waldo Emerson. Let us learn the revelation of all nature and thought, that the highest dwells within us, that the sources of nature are in our own minds. And next is our morning music. And it's entitled The Spacious Firmament on High. And now we'll have our chalice lighting, followed by joys and concerns. So if you have a joy or concern, please text or chat it into us this morning, and we'll read them for you. We light this chalice for the web of life which sustains us, for the sacred circle of life in which we have our being, for the earth, the sky, above and below, and for our Mother Earth, and for the mystery.
Cal is sharing a joy. He says, I've had several really good conversations this week with people whose politics and worldview are radically different from mine, but who share the notion that we are not going to change any of our current and long-standing tragedies and disasters until we can respect each other and work together across those differences. You know, that inherent worth and dignity thing that we say. So thanks for that, Cal. More joys and concerns. Catherine Johnson is asking that we please light a candle of love and concern for George Floyd's family and for all the individuals trying to protest peacefully. And I think Robert is piggybacking on that same candle that we should also light a candle for the business owners who've been looted or killed. Oh, that's right. It's Chris Carfanta's birthday. Shannon Anderson says, happy birthday, Chris. I'll ask you to light a candle. Grace and Sonia and I were going on a walk yesterday, and we ran into Owen, and that was just a pleasure to see him. So, just for catching up. Ramona would like us to light a candle for Rose Gorman. She's the mother of Donna Stubbs, who owns the Fiber House. Shannon Anderson says, a joy for the shade of an old, beautiful tree in the summer. And hold on, I think I got another. Nope, I think I'm good. Okay. Any other joys and concerns? Send them out now.
I'll light a belated birthday candle for Jolynn Andrews. Her birthday was in March, but I must have been, no, I mean April. Her birthday was in April, but I think I was busy holding still and didn't get it observed until recently.
I'd like to light a candle of joy for the end of the school year. We made it virtually. We virtually made it. And it really feels like summer now, so that's fun.
And one final candle for joys and concerns in our hearts, but unexpressed. And next, Ian will share with us the story for all ages.
Good morning. This is a story titled The Mystic and the Scientist. One day, a religious man approached a mystic and asked, "Does God exist?" "Allow me to go within for an answer," the mystic replied. After meditating for quite some time, expanding her heart consciousness to embrace the totality of existence, she answered, "I do not know what you mean by the word God, but I do know that this world is more mysterious and more wonderful than I could ever imagine. I know that you and I are part of something so much larger than our own lives. Perhaps this something larger is what you seek." Then the religious man approached a scientist. "Does God exist?" he asked. "Let me think," the scientist replied. And so she thought. She thought about the vastness of the universe, 156 billion light years, or something like 936 billion trillion miles in diameter, and the almost immeasurable smallness of a quark. She thought of how the energy of the Big Bang fuels the beating of her own heart, and then she answered, "I do not know what you mean by the word God, but I do know that this world is more mysterious and more wonderful than I could ever imagine. I know that you and I are part of something so much larger than our own lives. Perhaps this something larger is what you seek." The religious man then thought to himself. He thought of what he knows and what he does not know. He thought about how he knows what he knows and how he knows he doesn't know what he doesn't know. And he thought about his experience of the world and how it is but one tiny, infinitesimal fraction of all experience. He thought about his dependence on forces larger than himself, and he thought about the interdependence of all existence. He experienced wonder and pondered mystery, and then he knew in his soul the truth of what the mystic and the scientist said, that he is part of something so much larger than his own life. And then and only then did he think about what he'd call it.
Thank you, Ian. Next, we'll turn to the reading that will be followed by a few moments of silent reflection, and then Spirit of Life, the hymn. We will remain seated. I guess you can stand it. You can get up off your couch if you want to, but generally we remain seated. And we'll listen to it once, be played through, and then we'll, from our own separate sites, we will join together in singing it. Lord of all being, the longer I walk upon this great green earth, the less do I understand my purpose in being here. The less I am able to fathom the reason of my birth and span of life. But strange though it seems, the task of finding solutions to the riddle of me and the mystery of you seems less urgent these days. It's not that the question has lost significance, but that slowly I am learning to have faith. Faith that if I live my life intently, reverently, self-consciously, moment by moment, your universe will slowly unveil itself in its own good time. And so I do not force the issue, and so within life's splendor, I am at peace.
my heart all the stirrings of compassion. Blow in the wind, rise in the sea, move in the hand, giving life the shape of justice. Roots only close, wings set me free. Spirit of life, come to me, come to me.
Our message this morning is it comes from a sermon that was written by Kevin Tarsa, the Reverend Kevin Tarsa of the UU Community Church of the Mountains, Grass Valley, California. If that sounds vaguely familiar, it's because I chose a sermon earlier this month. Lisa Grutzmacher read it for us, and that was called Religious Naturalism. So this is the same UU minister, and while I was searching on his website, I found this one as well, also about mystery, and the association between mystery and religious explanations for that which we don't entirely understand. That is a part of our experience. So, Reverend Tarsa writes, well, his title was Where Do We Come From? What Are We? And Where Are We Going? And I've added a bit to the title, which is Where Does Religion Come From? Because that's the main thrust here. And he writes, I share in new member classes that the evolution of religion over many thousands of years traces the gradual movement from external authority to internal authority. In early human religiosity, the ultimate sources of power and influence were outside of humanity, in the sun, moon, stars, oceans, mountains, weather, earthquakes, volcanoes. Ultimate power and control were ascribed to the most powerful realities that people experienced, personified sometimes as goddesses, gods, and deities of many kinds. The next ring inward included powerful animals and trees and plants, sacred objects and images that represented the larger powers that controlled the world and people's lives. When humans began to live in larger, more layered, and more organized groups, power and authority became located in human structures and institutions, seen as gateways to the ultimate powers. Temples, religious traditions, rituals, sacred texts, and human intermediaries. The designated priestesses, priests, and shamans who interpreted the traditions and sacred signs and writings for everyone else, who communed directly with deities and served as bridges between the human realm and the sacred realm. With the development of the printing press and more efficient forms of transportation, knowledge and awareness spread, not only geographically, but through more of the layers of given societies. More and more people no longer needed to rely solely on the designated, educated religious leaders for information. People could read and interpret sacred texts like the Bible for themselves, and so the source of religious authority moved from the institutions toward the individual. This is when many new varieties of Christianity sprang up in Europe, because people were interpreting the writings for themselves and coming to all kinds of different conclusions. Imagine. But no sooner did certain people break from a tradition than they set up their own tradition as the one true religion, proclaiming that they themselves and their particular interpretations were the new and final source for all religious authority. As Helen Keller put it, the heresy of one age becomes the orthodoxy of the next. It is out of one of those chapters of someone's new and rigid version of Christianity in the 1500s that Unitarian Universalism arose and branched off from Calvinism, a very specific and narrow interpretation of Christian scripture. Our ancestors from many different streams were heretics in their times, a word that means, we know from its Greek origins, from its Greek roots, people who choose. By the early 1800s, Unitarians had shifted to an understanding of Jesus as a fully, albeit exceptional, human being, not uniquely divine, to an understanding of the Hebrew and Christian Bibles as human works that needed to be studied as we would study any historic human document, based on what we know about the times and the people, and to a belief that humans are morally and spiritually obligated to apply reason and current knowledge to all religious exploration and understanding. It was a way of thinking that had been foreshadowed earlier in that diagram of a solar system painted on the ceiling panel of a Unitarian church in Transylvania 400 years ago, no matter what the Catholic Church had insisted upon for centuries. Now, the panel that Reverend Tarsa refers to here is a depiction of the sun surrounded by circling planets, a diagram of the Copernican solar system. The primary source of religious authority was moving man in our Unitarian and Universalist ancestors, from ancient text, traditions, and institutions to human knowledge and awareness. It was reached, as William Ellery Channing preached, by each person's God-given capacity to reason. And then, hot on the tails of that shift in the United States, came the Transcendentalists, who pulled the ultimate source of religious authority completely inside the individual, sort of. The soul, Emerson wrote, is the perceiver and revealer of truth. We know truth when we see it. Let skeptic and scoffer say what they choose. Almost all of the New England Transcendentalists were Unitarian or strongly associated with Unitarianism. Many were, like Emerson, Unitarian ministers. Still, they were in some ways a varied lot. Margaret Fuller, Henry David Thoreau, Amos Bronson Alcott, Louisa May Alcott's father, Elizabeth Peabody, Theodore Parker, George and Sophia Ripley, among others. They were called the Club of the Like-Minded by outsiders, a description that they more or less accepted, saying that they truly were like-minded in that no two of them were of the same opinion. What they did hold in common was an emphasis on the primacy of self-consciousness, the idea that one's own consciousness is the legitimate access point to knowledge and truth, and that everyone has direct, intuitive, and immediate access to all things divine, if we would but open ourselves to it and not let anything get in the way. Emerson again. There is a deep power in which we exist and whose beatitude is accessible to us. He referred to this deep power and ultimate unity as the Oversoul. Emerson preached that there is no need for a church, for a priest, for a preacher, for a sacred text, for rituals, traditions, or anyone else's ideas. Every person of every social and education level, at every age in one's life, can access ultimate reality through their innermost awareness. And then to Emerson, a direct quote again. It comes to the lowly and the simple. It comes to whosoever will put off what is foreign and proud. It comes as insight. It comes as serenity. It comes as grandeur. Within us is the soul of the whole. And then Tarsa says, it is a mystical approach inspired by Vedic texts and European philosophies and beamed through this American crafted lens of Ralph Waldo Emerson. For the transcendentalists, the final authority for knowing what is true is one's personal experience and direct, intuitive perception and knowledge. We know truth when we see it. Theologically, this is pretty much where we still are in our tradition and our nation 150 years later. Although they were both revered and ridiculed in their time, Emerson and the Transcendentalists shaped American thinking significantly and pointed U.S. culture toward prioritizing individuality and toward the primacy of personal consciousness as the source of authority. This is evident, I think, everywhere in our national politics now, wherein people come to their own felt conclusions regardless of outside information or evidence that challenges these conclusions. The thing is, if we follow our tradition, the use of our reason and the application of our accumulating knowledge ought to lead us to the realization that we individuals are not the center of the universe after all. Heretical as that message may be in our circles, the world and truth do not revolve around us individuals and our own consciousness. Ongoing human research keeps pointing out to us that what we are able to see, perceive, and understand is shaped and bounded by our genetic blueprint, our life experience, our philosophy, our psychology, our neurochemistry, our diets, and the sound of our names. So that he says, okay, to explain that last comment, a relative of Kevin Tarsa named Nicholas just announced his engagement to his fiancée, Nicole. How much more similar could those names be? Tarsa says, I think of my friends Paula and Paul and Janine and George. My first love's name early in my young adult life was Colin and Kevin. Of the 5 sounds in our 2 brief names, 3 are exactly the same. It's referred to in the research as the name letter effect. People disproportionately choose spouses, places to live, and occupations with names similar to their own. We think we are making these intimate and vital life decisions based on our careful evaluation and awareness, when something as simple as the spelling or sound of our names is actually pulling some of the strings. Tarsa says, these kinds of things fascinate me because of what they reveal about human nature in general. I am intrigued by the way that what I eat influences how and what I think and feel. That sitting in a hard chair as opposed to a soft chair makes people more uncompromising when they are negotiating. That having the microscopic parasite Toxoplasma gondii, which infects almost a quarter of Americans older than the age of 12, makes people more extroverted and less conscientious than people without the parasite. All these amazing subtle influences that shape our feelings, our thinking, and our behavior without our knowing it, when all the while we think we are choosing freely and with complete conscious control. Again and again, the message is that we are not as conscious as we think we are of our own biases, of the limits of our perception and awareness, of the invisible influences on our choices and our actions. The NPR show and podcast, The Hidden Brain, looks at just these kinds of invisible influences on us. A recent episode asked, "Where does religion come from?" In it, the host, Shankar Vedantam, highlights the work of Azim Sharif, a psychology professor at the University of British Columbia, who studies religion from a psychological perspective. Sharif begins with the assumption that religion arose, evolved, and continues because it offers some sort of survival advantage in terms of natural selection, allowing people who are religious to survive and pass on their genetic material to their offspring. Sharif points out that for most of human history, we lived in small groups in which everyone knew everyone, and in which everyone knew everyone's behavior. It is difficult in small groups to get away with cheating or stealing or killing or not contributing to the work needed. But when human groups become larger than 150 or so, to 500, to 1,000, to 10,000 people, those natural small group controls on behavior were no longer sustainable. People could cheat and steal and kill and freeload and get away with it, which is not helpful to the health and sustainability and genetic survival of the group. Sharif and others say that religion arose as a cultural innovation to allow us to succeed in these larger groups by enhancing trust and cooperation. This is not a new concept, but not just any religion, Sharif says. What worked best to corral human behavior was the idea of a supernatural punisher, a large, all-seeing, all-knowing, punitive God, the perfect opposite of what our universalist tradition teaches. It turns out that believing that you are a sinner in the hands of an angry God confers an evolutionary advantage on you and your people. And to that, Tarsa writes, "Oh, crap." In one study of college students, Sharif discovered that the more a person believed in God to be on the punitive side of the spectrum, the less likely the person was to cheat on a test, whereas the more a person believed their God to be loving, the more likely they were to cheat on a test. Again, Tarsa resorts to, "Oh, crap." Not a great selling point for universalism and liberal religion. Sharif says that societies that have been able to grow the largest with religions that they believe in have had this idea of supernatural punishment at their core because it is an effective deterrent and an effective connector to people you've never even met. Sharif points out that all the world's major religions today arose at times when human societies were struggling with the challenges of size, complexity, or scarcity, and therefore struggling with trust and cooperation. Believing in a big bad God helped larger societies in many cases. The good news, bad news in these our complex times, when trust and cooperation are a challenge, is that there is a chicken and egg reality here. Which kinds of religions reign in a given time and place is context dependent and can change. For example, small groups and societies tend to have small gods who are not particularly powerful or punitive. And local conditions like individual ecosystems can create conditions where certain beliefs flourish and where other beliefs fade away. Now, what is considered sacred isn't necessarily something religious. We sacralize things like freedom, patriotism, and our nation, for example, so there are ramifications for our country. Sharif says that the countries in which religion is least important are the countries with the highest faith in the rule of law and trust in institutions. On the flip side, as Shankar Vedantam explains, Azim thinks that if regulations and good governments provide the trust and cooperation that religious bonds once provided, new kinds of faith might flourish. Religions that don't have an angry God who threatens to punish you if you step out of line. Religions that don't talk a lot about hell and damnation, but instead spend more time on building community. So where does that leave us? And what does all of this have to do with curiosity? And then Tarsa writes, I say that we turn to Catholicism for a moment. There is in Catholicism a little known and not actively publicized escape clause. For all its clear dogma and firm listing of what is okay and what is not okay, Catholic tradition notes in the fine print that in the end, each Catholic may appeal to the primacy of their own conscience. No matter what the church tradition teaches, one's personal conscience is the final arbiter when navigating difficult moral questions. And then Tarsa writes in parentheses, Pope Francis caught flack and was publicly accused of heresy when he was reaffirming the primacy of conscience 2 years ago in November of 2017. He said that priests are supposed to inform Catholic consciences, not replace them. I, that is Tarsa, I say that what we are called to now is not so much a primacy of isolated personal consciousness, as our transcendentalist forebears taught, but rather to a primacy of conscience that is informed not only by our incomplete consciousness, but also informed by a sense of humility that recognizes that we don't know everything, even and especially about ourselves, that understands that we must draw on sources of authority both inside and outside ourselves in order to know what we need to know and need to do, that recognizes that we as individuals are not the center of the universe around which all else revolves, that we are not isolated beings. I'm not suggesting that we let go of our inner authority completely, but that we add to it, couple it with an openness to outer sources of knowledge and authority. It's part of our maturation as a religious tradition. UUism is rather young in religious terms and much like adolescents who need to define themselves, often angrily and with a great deal of drama, as separate from their parents in order to grow into who they are and will become. UUism has defined itself by what it is not and by a powerfully self-centered theology. Maturing as a faith will require that we remain true to our own consciousness while keeping our hearts and our heads open to answers beyond our own. A primacy of conscience requires that we stay genuinely and endlessly curious. For the last 2.5 years, I have been repeating to myself the mantra, get curious, not furious. Get curious, not furious. Not always certain that getting furious wasn't the better way. But in these times, staying curious is essential. Emerson valued curiosity as a path to overcoming the fear of not conforming, curiosity as a path to being an individual. Curiosity, especially considering what we are learning about human nature, is also a path to overcoming the fear of being more than an individual, of being thoroughly and intimately interconnected and interdependent. Emerson saw curiosity as an avenue to staying ever receptive to the ultimate oneness of nature that is named God by many. As many of us might put it, curiosity is about staying ever open to the spirit of love as we know it now and as it will continue to be revealed. Deeply curious may we ever be. And now in your In your announcement, your order of service that Victor provided, you'll see the words to hymn number 83, Winds Be Still, which we'll sing together now.
Winds be still, storm clouds pass, and silence come. Peace grace this time with harmony. Fly, bird of hope, and shine, light of love, and in calm let all find tranquility. Bird fly high, lift our gaze toward distant view, help us to sense life's mystery. Fly high and far, and lead us each to see how we move through the winds of eternity. Light shine in, illuminate our inward view, help us to see with clarity. Shine bright and true, so we may join our songs in new sounds that become full symphony.
Okay, and now it's time to remind you that we still have an offering to make if you can. You may write a check to the UUFS, Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Sheridan, and send it to Ramona Stein, whose address is in the announcements this week. Or there's a website you can use that's called SheridanUU.org at tithe.ly. And if you'll join me in blessing the offering, let this be an offering to sustain and strengthen this place, which is so sacred to many of us, a community of memory and hope, for we are the keepers of the dream. And our closing words today are entitled The Lord's Prayer Revisited. Creator and creation, we are here, and we know paradise is beyond our reach, yet at our fingertips. Here the sacred is revealed, and we hope for peace and restoration of the soul. We acknowledge we are not in charge and relinquish control. Let the realm of humanity be transcended by all that is holy. We know we are not powerless, but also not all powerful, for we walk in eternal time. Amen. Now we'll turn to a discussion. If you have comments about this sermon today, please chat them into Ian or text them. and he will share them with us.
I just thank you for the talk, Janet. That was well chosen to round out the month. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. I had a bunch of thoughts about it. One thing I was wondering is this idea that our consciousness is incomplete, and I like that idea. I'm also recently fascinated by a new trend in science that there are a few really high level people questioning some of our most fundamental paradigms about like how the universe works on the whole, and talking about the idea that awareness, or you could call it consciousness, is fundamental to the structure of the universe and not a byproduct of our material brains, which is sort of the traditional view that science has had for a long time. And I guess I just bring it up to say that I feel like that thought that they're having and wanting to research is kind of in parallel with the religious progression that you described. So this idea that we went really far in one direction towards, looking microscopically at the brain and how it figures things out, and then turning to look back the other direction, we realize that all these things are happening across the whole cosmos in concert with each other. And there's awe in that, and certainly no small amount of mystery. So.
Thank you for that. I think it is this tight walk we are asked to walk again and again, in terms of pushing our knowledge, pushing the boundaries of our knowledge, and trying to understand more and more, and yet at the same time preserving the ambiguity or the complexity that we discover as we look at this little piece of it, like our nutrition and how that affects how we think and perceive, or other things that Tarsa mentioned. It's a funny balance if there are entities in our gut that make us trend this way or that way, and all the possible things that can impinge on this complex human thought process, which is trivial compared to the complexity of the universe. Yeah. So I think it's a reminder that we value the wisdom we have. We don't relinquish that just because we don't know it all, and yet we have the humility to say, we don't have the whole picture, and if we can collaborate with many, many, many humans and the wisdom of many cultures, we have a pretty good idea of where we keep coming down, that there's a fundamental wisdom and some guidelines that we can follow. But that to have the supreme arrogance to think that I as an individual or I as my political group have all the answers is just, unfortunately, very, very limiting, self-limiting to ourselves and the people that have to live with us. So.
Well, I found it fascinating that piece that he mentioned about a study where people who believe in a loving God were more likely to cheat. And it just reminds me of this idea that maybe someone else said, you don't need religion to get bad people to do good things. You need religion to get good people to do bad things. Right? That it's this idea that this, God then gives you the ticket to break your own intuited rules about what's right and wrong because he's some arbitrary higher authority that's going to, keep your name checked off in the book or whatever. I think that's really fascinating. I thought too about this idea of the evolution of our species into the, out of the Stone Age and into the era of agriculture and cities as requiring the development of religion. And I just thought about this idea that in the last few hundred years, as like Nietzsche described the death of God, how people's belief in God has radically diminished. It doesn't mean that the psychological function isn't still there, that we're being watched, that our behavior is under the view of some supreme force, that seems to be more inherent. We can believe on a conscious level, oh, we're independent, we're our own people, we can make our own decisions. But, if you peek under the lid, there's a whole other level of depth to our concern for a higher power. And maybe that evolutionarily is our brain's innate awareness that we are part of a group. And maybe in prehistoric times, that would have jived directly with our experience of living in that band of humans that we spent our whole lives with. But now when we're in this huge context of people, way more than we can keep track of, that innate sense is still there, and we might ascribe it to God, or we might just ascribe it to our own paranoia. But maybe it can still be like a compass, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think we have to find another resolution of these parts of ourselves. Victor and I took a class many years ago on sort of constructing one's own theology, and I came up with something that God was the kind of the rubber band that connected you to other people, and when you were kind of in touch with that connection and that tug toward other people, that was your awareness of this higher experience of life. And I've got rubber bands on my mind these days because I'm making masks for people, and it's very hard to get good rubber band, not rubber bands, but elastic. And I'm finding that some elastic is very flexible and has a lot of stretch, and other elastic is in name only. It doesn't do much. But I do think that we need to acknowledge that there is this dynamic connection between us all. And we lose that, and we lose something powerful in terms of our intention and our capacity to cooperate for this common good, and this, I guess, common wisdom would be part of that too.
So Sue Roberts has a comment. She says, I really enjoyed the discussion of obedience to individual conscience. That major different ideas of the Reformation. I disagree with the name being part of your determinism. And so she doesn't feel like that fits her at all. And maybe it was a bit of a statistical thing. So there are clearly lots of us who are outliers, but maybe statistically couples have some amount of jiving, or it said occupations as well.
Yeah, I had trouble with that as I'm, going through names and careers and all that. I have noticed that it seems like there are many couples whose names are kind of similar, but yeah, I don't know much about that. I think the purpose of that, Tarsa's purpose, was just to remind us that when we start looking in a scientific way at this little study and that little study, there are many many little pieces of information out there that suggest that there's something kind of subliminal going on at times in our behavior and choices and all. But I don't think he meant for us to get too far down any of those roads, because the research was it looks at such minor effects, yeah. But it reminds us. He reminds us that it's just such a complicated picture. We have to we have to remind ourselves that we in our individuality are not omniscient. We don't see every part of the picture.
I would say, of course, it's always anecdotal and your sample sizes are really small, but working with kids, you notice names like, oh boy, every boy that we've had with this name has just been really hard to work with, and the converse being every boy with this other name has just been a delight. And you hesitate to assign causality, right? Just because there does seem to be a correlation, but you also don't want to ignore your gut too. Maybe there's something to that. So
yeah, and names of people that you knew 60, 50 years ago still impinge on a choice you might make for a child's name. Oh, I couldn't possibly name that child Fanny, for example, because I knew a Fanny, perfectly nice woman, but that was a long time ago, and this child is not a Fanny. I picked a poor choice of a name to use as an example, but you kind of get what I mean.
Well, we don't have any other comments right now, but feel free to continue your discussion in the Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And Victor has an announcement, meditation with social distancing, and that will be in the Asher's backyard at 4:30 today, and that address is
1433 Stonegate Drive.
Okay, 1433 Stonegate Drive. So if you'd like to attend the meditation group, they're meeting again outdoors, 4:30 at Victor and Janet's house. Holly Hogarty says, thank you, Janet, for this thought-provoking presentation.
You're most welcome. All right, and at this time we'll extinguish the chalice. We extinguish the chalice here that it might glow gently in our hearts. May it light your path as you leave this place or we leave this setting that we've shared. May it guide your way until we are together again.